Hello, I'm glad you're here. This is Jennifer. Today's technique is definitely a must-try technique. It works with any stencils you have, and I call this an ink press stencil technique. Now, I will be demonstrating it with several cards today in different types of stencils, including regular stencils and layering stencils. The results are beautiful. You get soft color in your background along with some texture thanks to some dry embossing. I think it's best to just dive in so you can see what this technique is all about. And let's start with a layering stencil set. We'll do a single stencil in my next example. Now on this one, I'm using a new Altenew layering stencil set that has 4 stencils. Now these are very easy to line up. There is a guide included. Do know there are coordinating dies available separately if you're interested in cutting out any of the little flower clusters. However, I'm creating just a solid background, so I won't be using the dies today. Next, I'm setting up my die cut machine to make an impression. So I have my Spellbinders Platinum 6 here. I put down my platform, and now I have my tan embossing mat, which is this flexible piece. This is what you use to make an impression with a die. Today, we're making an impression with the stencil. All die cut machines should have this capability. Just follow the instructions in your manual. So I have this ready to go and setting it aside. Next, I'm picking out which stencil I'm going to use for the ink press technique. I decided to take the stencil that is the outline of the flowers. I will explain more about that in a moment. I'll take the stencil and I'll tape it like a hinge on the edge of a piece of white cardstock. So the front of the stencil is facing up towards the camera. And I'm just putting some temporary tape over to the side. Creating a hinge is very helpful for this technique. Okay, so now I'm going to open this up like a book and start applying ink to the back side of my stencil. There are many ways you can do this. I definitely find the best way is to use a brayer. And I find the best sprayers are the ones from Tim Holtz. These are great for applying ink. So I have some crisp dye ink from Altenew. You could use any dye ink or pigment ink here. And I'm rolling my brayer to pick up some of the ink, and I'm applying it to the back side of my stencil. This is a mountain mist color, which is very soft and great for this technique. You could use a darker color, definitely could use a darker color, but I was going for a soft look today. Using a darker color would definitely be more impactful in the end, so keep that in mind. It's totally up to you. So I applied ink to the back of the stencil. Now I'm closing this like a book. Then I'll pick this up, lay it cardstock side down onto the embossing mat. The stencil is facing up. Put my embossing plate on top of that and run it through. This will apply pressure, which will cause the stencil to do a little bit of dry embossing onto the cardstock, adding a little texture. And it presses the ink onto the cardstock. So we'll have white raised areas, and in the valleys, the background will have that soft pool color. It is really a great way to use your stencil creatively, because if you inked over the stencil, those little flower blobs would be colored and your background would be white. Now we have white flower blobs and our background has color. This is definitely the easiest way to create a background from the solid space of your stencil. Now I'm repeating this just to make it a little bit darker. You don't have to. If you didn't get like really smooth results, you can repeat it as many times as you want to get the results that you want. Thanks to that hinge, it won't shift each time. So here we can see those gorgeous results. I love having that blue color in the background. So now we can use our stencils as they were meant to be used. So I'm going to ink over these open areas. So anything that was white in those openings will now be this pink pearl color. Now the advantage of doing this is that I'll have a soft blue background and true pink flowers. If I would have done this on light blue cardstock or inked up the whole background with light blue, my pink flowers would have a blue tint to them, right? Because you'd be layering the color. But by doing this ink press technique with the stencil, I'm able to get a blue background, true blue, and true pink flowers. So think about it. I could have done that ink press technique with like a dark navy color. And then when I'm done, I would have the white flowers that are raised with the navy background, and I could put light colors of ink onto the flowers. It's a very easy way to create a solid colored background where all the colors stay true. So now I'm on to the second layer of the stencil. This time I'm using Coral Bliss, which is one of my favorite colors, and applying that on top. I'm using my Altenew ink blending tools to do this. You could use whatever tools you prefer. Now it's time to do the leaves. Now with this particular stencil, my leaves will go on the blue ink. But think about it. When I put green ink over blue, it'll still look pretty green. If I would have put pink ink over blue, it would have gone purple. So I'm able to apply enough green ink over this that you won't really see the blue coming through. So it worked great for this layering stencil set. So check any layering stencil sets you may have. This is a great way to do a really full color background and have bright true colors. So after doing those leaves with a light amount of green field ink, I believe it is, I will then put on the last stencil, and in the leaf areas, the leaf details, I'll put a heavier amount of the same color using a smaller Altenew ink blending tool. This stencil gives you the detail areas for the flowers and the leaves. So I'm just doing the leaves with the green, using a smaller tool. Then I'll clean my stencil, and then I'll do the details of the flower with a darker red color. I'll use Heartbeat Red for that. Now we're done, and we have a background that is completely colored. I chose a soft blue for that background, but you could have done a darker color if you want to. And if you look closely at the flowers, those areas are raised thanks to using that embossing mat. I wanted to keep this card very simple so a lot of the background would show, and just do a bold sentiment. So I'm using the Altenew Bold You die. Now there is a stamp set, you can see it there to the left. I'm just using the coordinating die alone. I cut it 3 times from black cardstock and glued those layers together and added that to the top center of the card. Now this is very bold. You could do a softer cardstock if you want, but I wanted it to stand out. I also stamped a sentiment from the Altenew Inside Out stamp set, stamped that with the black ink on a thin cardstock strip, layered additional scraps of white cardstock behind it so it's strong and has dimension, and I'll glue that on top of the U die cut. I really liked keeping this very simple so the background would show. Here's a closer look at that Inside Out Thanks set. I really like the sentiments on it. It's great for the inside of cards too. Because there's not much on this card, I want to make sure everything is straight, so I'm using a T-ruler to add both. This is the new Misty T-ruler. It actually fits inside the Misty too. It's handy because it's smaller, but any T-ruler would work. I added some white dot details to the flowers and added some soft pink pearls from Studio Katia to the background. So this is a very simple card because I really wanted that background to show. So if you look closely, you can see that all of the flower images are raised, and we have that soft pool colored background. I could have done a darker color for the background, but it would have messed up my leaves here. I would have had to get creative with that. But on many layering stencil sets, you could go bold and it would work great. And I have another example later in this video. So think about what stencils you have that you can use this technique to create a different look. When I trimmed down this background, I had a little scrap left over, so I thought I'd make a bonus card with that. Now for this one, since there's so much white space, I decided to use an embossing folder on it. This is the new Altenew Curving Leaves embossing folder. It's a 3D folder with beautiful detail. I'm putting the front of a note card into the folder and running that through. This is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch folded note card. Now I just put that on my platform and then a cutting plate on top, run it through and get beautiful detail. If you want to, you can wet your cardstock with mist of water first, but I usually don't do that because these embossing folders work great even without it. Check out that gorgeous detail. Okay, now the rest of this was very simple. I added that little extra border of the floral background to the bottom, and I added a U die cut, just as I did before. This time I colored white cardstock with a matching ink so that the U would match the background. I also added a gold cardstock scrap or little strip there along the top of the border and added some gold pearls. So because there's a lot of white space showing, I used the embossing folder, which adds a lot of interest to it. And I was able to use that small scrap instead of letting it go to waste. Okay, my next example uses a single stencil just to demonstrate that this works with whatever stencil you may have. And then I did some layering stencil on top of that. So let's start first by doing the background. For this, I used an older Altenew stencil called Leaf Bed, and I am taping it once again to the edge of a piece of cardstock. You could use any cardstock for this that you like. I'm just using Neenah Classic Crest Solar White. Okay, so I have that taped like a hinge like before, and I have my die cut machine ready. This time I'm using the pastel sunrise color. Altenew has a lot of soft colors that work great for this. Again, you could use darker color, but in this case, I'm going to do a lot on top of it, so I wanted it to stay soft. Okay, so now I can close that up, put it onto my embossing mat, and run it through. This will create the impression and transfer the ink. And think about it, the inking is reverse of what you would get if you just put down the stencil and inked over it. Now I'm repeating this just to make it a little bit darker, but not too dark. Repeating it also helps to kind of smooth the results, but as you can see, the results are great as is. Now, as I ink this up again and repeat the process, I thought I'd mention something you could do with this is to maybe do like navy ink for this process. Then when you're done, line up the same stencil and ink with maybe a light blue ink or a pink ink, and you would get a two-tone background that would cover up all the white cardstock. And you can see you have that impression too. So there are many ways to use this technique, and I'll share more in the future. So I've trimmed this background down. I'll save those extra pieces for another card in the future. Now it's time to add some inking on top of it, and I thought it'd be fun to do a floral cluster right on top of it, up in the top left. So a lot of the bottom right would still show that ink press we just did. I'm using the new Altenew Meadow Burst layered stencil set to create that beautiful bouquet at the top. There are several stencils in here, and they are very easy to line up thanks to 3 little holes that you can line up each time, and I'll demonstrate that as we go. I have my Brutus Monroe stick and stamp mat. This just holds the cardstock in place, and it also holds the stencil in place on it. It's really quite handy, but you could ink this up however you want. I've arranged the first stencil up there on the top left corner, and I have my guide off to the left so I can follow along. After applying green bamboo ink over the stencil, I'm going to mark where those 3 holes are that will allow me to line up the next stencils very easily. The first hole is down here on my card, so I'm just tracing in it with a pencil lightly. The other hole is up here on the top. I'll just put some ink onto my mat with that, and the other hole is over on the left. So those are the 3 holes that will allow me to line up the next stencil. They're hard to see in the video, but they are there. Okay, so now I've got the next stencil. I just line up the holes on this stencil with the little marks we just made, and I'm easily able to line it up. It's kind of hard to see in the video because everything's white, but I promise it's not hard to do. Now over this, I'll do a darker green, and you can see how fast I'm able to create this beautiful image. So far, all I did was 2 stencils, and we have this. Now we'll come to the third stencil, line up those little holes, and do some more green inking. I chose different green inks for this. This is Green Fields. Now, what I'm doing is on top of that ink press background that we did with that first stencil. Because I used a light color of ink, I'm just going right on top of it, and you won't be able to tell it's underneath. And I'm doing all of this stenciling right on top of the texture of the background, and I had no problem at all. The final stencil adds the little floral bits to the image, and I went with like a dark rust color for this. And then on that same stencil, there's this little image that you layer into the center of the floral part. It has an outline engraved on the stencil, so it's easy to line up. And over this, I put a dark red. I now can erase the dot we put on our background and clean off my sticky mat. Now to remove my background from the sticky mat, I like to hold the background flat and peel away the mat. And look at that. We have that soft inking and texture on the bottom, and then over it on the top, we have that bold, colorful stenciling. Now to finish this off, I used the older Altenew Fancy Hello die. Man, I've used that a lot. And also the Tiny Sentiments Hello stamp from Altenew. This one is great for little sentiment strips to go with the word hello. I'll be using that one a lot. This is my first time trying it. Now I did the hello with 3 white stacked die cuts. Then I did a gold cardstock die cut on top, but offset slightly, so a little bit of the white peeks around. I gold heat embossed I've Been Thinking About You on white cardstock and added that also to the top of the card. That background is trimmed down and added to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch note card. And I finished it off with some pearls from Studio Katia. So this demonstrates that you can do this ink press technique with a single stencil. You could make it the focal point of your card by using more bold colors, or make it soft to be the background of a card as I did here. Okay, next I'm using a fun layering set that can be used in many different ways, and we'll start off all of our backgrounds by doing the ink press technique. You definitely could skip doing this, but I thought it was fun to add a little texture and leave some areas white. Okay, for these cards, and I made many more backgrounds too, I used the new Altenew Fancy Sweater Stencils. There are 2 stencils in this, but there are a billion ways you can layer them to create really cool backgrounds. Now this is an image from the Altenew website, just on some suggestions on how you can layer them, and it tells you how to do so. I'm just winging it today and creating as many different backgrounds as I can. I really like products that allow you to use them in many ways, and look at all of these different colorful backgrounds. You can go soft or you can go really bold, and I'll do a little bit of both today. So I'm starting with the first stencil that just has the little diamonds, and I'll do the ink press technique with this. I have it taped to a piece of cardstock, and I'm using a very light blue ink here. This is Dewdrop, to apply to the back of the stencil with my brayer, and then I'll run it through my die cut machine to do the embossing, just as we did earlier. And look at that, how it presses that ink into the background, and all of those white diamonds are raised. This is reverse of what you would get if you used this stencil the normal way by just applying ink over it. And I did a few backgrounds like this to get started. Now I'm taking that same stencil, and I could put it right on top and ink into that white area, but I'm offsetting it a bit so I can ink over this and have some dark blue diamonds in between our white raised diamonds. Now again, there are many ways you can do this. You could go really bold with that ink press that I did to start off with, but I just wanted a soft blue background with those white raised diamonds to start with, and I did that with all of my examples today. You could have done the press with the other stencil and get started that way. Really doesn't matter. It's hard to see that those white diamonds are raised, but definitely looks impactful in real life. Now it's time for the second stencil, and I just randomly picked a way for it to line up. There are many options, as I showed with that guide earlier. Over this, I'm putting a medium color blue. This is the Eastern Sky, which is a beautiful blue. Didn't put it down too heavy, so I could use that color again in another position. So now you can see a fun background building. Now there again are a million ways I could line this up here, and I'm just kind of moving it around, and you can get a feel for the different looks you can get by just shifting your stencil a bit. You can shift it up, to the left, to the right, doesn't matter, and you get a different look each time. So I picked a spot and applied ink over this. This time I did Iceberg, which is a little bit lighter. And once I remove that, look at this fun background. So we have the soft blue that we started with, the white raised diamonds, and then the color that we've added on top. So I continued to play with this background and also create some others. If you've never tried geometric layering stencils like this one, I recommend trying them. It's so much fun to just play. Play with your inks, experiment with color, and have fun. And when you're done, you have lots of colorful backgrounds that you can use on cards. They would be great for simple birthday cards, anything you need. All right, so here is this first background finished. I'm just crazy about those results. And here are the rest of the backgrounds I created. I love how they all look a little bit different over there on the left. I did trim them down so they're ready to go onto cards, but I keep all of the scraps because those little scraps are beautiful. I even have more than I'm showing you here, and I can use those on a card in the future. Now to finish off these cards, I used the Bold You die that I showed you earlier. And I'm also using the Altenew Sentiment Strips 2 stamp set for the sentiment that says, "Thoughts of you make me smile." On some of these cards, I also used the older Altenew All the Hearts die. This creates tiny little hearts that are fun to add to your card. So here's my first card. I used pink and peach inks for this background. I trimmed the inked background down and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I used that heart die to create tiny little gold hearts that I glued into the pattern on the background, which I thought was a fun way to step up this simple card. The Bold You die cut is 2 white die cuts with gold die cut on top and a gold heat emboss sentiment on that white cardstock strip. I did add additional cardstock layers underneath our inked background to make it stand up a bit. Doing this makes a big difference when you have a background that you want in focus. You can see that little shadow that you get around the outside edge. All right, here's another background. For this one, I did the ink press technique with the diamond stencil that you saw me do earlier. Then all of the other inking on this was with the same diamond stencil. I didn't even use the second stencil on it. I just shifted each time and did different colors of blue ink. You can see the original soft blue background we did with the press, and then the raised white diamonds are still there too. I also added little hearts into the background using silver cardstock this time. And I finished off this with the same type of sentiment, this time in silver and blue cardstock. I'm actually planning to repeat this background today for a baby card for my friend who just had a little boy. Okay, here is my next one. I trimmed the center section down to a smaller piece so that I had lots of scraps left over for this one. I really like this one a lot. I did greens and blues. You can still see underneath it all my white raised diamonds. This time I did a little bit less shifting, so we had more overlapping of ink colors. So much fun to create. I added blue pearls to this pattern this time. This is definitely going to my friend who loves blue colors. I think he'll be happy with it. All right, I still have these pieces left over to turn into a card, but I ran out of time and had to make dinner. So next time maybe. The supplies always are linked below in my YouTube description, but go over to my blog. There's a lot more there to share, and you have the ability to bookmark cards or videos for future reference. At the end, I'll have a couple other videos that are related that may be helpful. That first video shows another example of doing this ink press stencil technique, so be sure to check that out. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you soon.